Thanks everyone who's joining us live on LinkedIn now. It's Sean Kidney from the Clumb Bonds Initiative. This is the second of the monthly town hall series that I've started, talking about how to speed up the transition. We're just waiting for a few people to dial in and we'll get going. In just a second, my friend Sony Kapoor is getting himself a cup of coffee as we get started. So I might get going on the introduction. This idea is the conversation, which means I'm looking for all of you to put up your hand to join us to make a comment. We have a problem. The world is still veering in the direction of total and utter calamity. We currently, well, I would say on current trajectories, despite all the talk of 2030 targets and 2050 targets, on current trajectories of climate change, we're going to see large-scale loss of life as this century runs out, drastic change to the climate, the likelihood that we have to abandon large waves of the planet, or at least abandon them to science fiction movie making and insulated bodysuits and so on, because places like North Africa, southern USA, northern India become uninhabitable because of the extraordinary heat that we expect to happen. We have not been successful, folks, to the extent that when the IPCC publishes its report, which is full of possibilities, necessarily so, the possibility involved now to avoid utter catastrophe, effectively jumping off a cliff when it comes to emissions. That's what the graphs of emissions reductions look like. They're drastic, they're extreme. And now I get conversations in every country, and I've just been traveling around the world, in every country saying, oh, but you know, that's really hard for us because we're special, our country, we need to take it more gently. Unfortunately, that was the conversation for 30 years ago. It's not the conversation for now. We are stuck with an extreme challenge of a drastic reduction in emissions. We need to, well, according to the IPCC, see 65% reductions by 2035. That is not a target. That is a minimum that we need to get to have a chance, and it's only a chance even then, to avoid catastrophic climate change. In fact, at the moment, the key performance indicators, temperatures, weather incidences, greenhouse gas are running at the worst possible scenario. And when I've been speaking to climate scientists recently, they've been essentially very depressed about what they have seen in the past 12 months, a year of records being broken, records that we do not want to be broken. This is likely to get worse, not better. Our 2035 minimum target from the IPCC is likely to become a ceiling that has to be reduced. That's the difficulty we face now. Let's be clear about the challenge. On the plus side there, because there is a plus side, there is no doubt the transition conversation is now the norm du jour all around the world. I've just come back from a week in Japan where I'm going to say the government's green transformation program, despite being diverted by conversations about replacing coal with ammonia or gas, is actually fantastic. The extent to which they have woven in aggressive support for industry to shift to low carbon paths, the extent to which they've woven in just transition measures such as training, support for industry, keeping the workers employed and so on, is amazing. Is it enough? No. There is no plan in the world that I can see so far at a government level that's enough, maybe Bhutan. Is it an amazing advance? Absolutely. Along with the IRA in the USA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is 80% about clean energy. There are boondoggles for gas that Joe Manchin had inserted to get the act through Congress, but it is fundamentally amazing. And the various EU investment programs and China, which continues, despite the bleating of the West, to invest more in renewable energy than anyone everywhere else, 63 gigawatts last year. Extraordinary growth. And to be pushing electric vehicles. We are seeing a global electric vehicle revolution, not because of Tesla. We are seeing it because of China, with subsidies, with support, with an aggressive push, partly climate change, partly geopolitical to avoid oil being shipped through the Straits of Malacca and shifting to domestic energy. Hey, whatever works. But in 2022, some 20% of cars sold in China were electric. Last year, we believe the figure got close to a third. And this year, it looks like it's on its way to 40%. That's why the global oil industry is toast, not for anything we're doing in Europe or the US or other countries. It all helps, but it's China that counts. Hey, there's a lot to be done in China. But they still represent 28% of global emissions. Huge task to shift that economy around. And we would like to see them do more. But Shanghai published the transition plan just before New Year. Not a bad start. Version 1 needs a version 2, like every single one of them. You get the idea. There is hope. There is capital, enormous amounts of capital. And this is where I want to bring in my friend, Sony Kapoor. Sony is the CEO of the Nordic Institute for Finance, Technology and Sustainability. Well, he's really been doing this sort of thing for years in one form or another. He was in his past dark history, I'm told, an investment banker. He might tell us about that in a minute. Has been worked in asset management. I know he's been doing advice to try and push the Norwegian pension fund, NIBM, to do more about emerging market investments. And he's been doing policy advisory around the world. We first got to know each other doing a project for the State Council of China years ago on essentially mobilizing capital for climate action. We have a big challenge, an especially big challenge in shifting capital or to support changes in emerging markets. And I'm careful to say shifting capital because there's a domestic mobilization of emerging markets agenda as much as there is an agenda of moving capital from richer countries to emerging markets. We're going to talk about that, explain it. But understand this, at least in the infrastructure space, some 70% of infrastructure to be built between now and 2050 is in emerging markets. It's got to be green. You get the idea about the kind of capital requirements in emerging markets, and that's reflected in every area. We are growing a string of 20 million population cities around the world. We're already growing quite a few of them. They're not in rich countries. They're in emerging markets. The urbanization of Nigeria, of India, of Indonesia is something that is important to everyone on this planet, because if those go in the wrong direction, they will create a lot more carbon emissions. If they go in the right direction, they can not only make life better, more livable, more productive for the citizens of those cities, but also reduce emissions. You get the idea. Please, everyone, put up your hand if you would like to make a comment. I will call you in. We've got a small group today verbally as we go in, and I've already warned a couple of you to be prepared. As you know, I like to put people on the spot. But Sony, thank you for joining me on this conversation today. This, of course, Sony, is really the first stage of the project we've been talking about, an intervention in markets. So treat this, as I said, as the start of our dialogue to lead to a JV in terms of a document of some sort. But Sony, tell me your perspective on how we get things happening quickly, how we speed up the transition that has started, but is still not moving fast enough.
Ooh, that's not a topic for 10 minutes, but I will try and address at least the main points. Well, I think a good way of thinking about this is the broader state of the world. And I start with that because there was time when it made sense, perhaps 10, perhaps 20 years back, to think of climate sustainability as an afterthought once one had dealt with, the euro crisis or, financial crisis or, OECD country policy, so on and so forth, right? But we are now, the world in 2024 is at a point where it no longer makes sense to talk of the global macroeconomy, global growth, global demography, global security, global conflict, development, what have you. in isolation from an overwhelming urgency, macro importance of the climate agenda more narrowly, and the broader environmental agenda, which also encompasses, dangerous levels of biodiversity loss, land degradation, and so on and so forth. So we are in 2024 at a point where I would say, as someone who works across macroeconomic policymaking, finance, sustainability, and development, that climate policy needs to be upgraded to sit alongside monetary policy and fiscal policy. Nothing less. Nothing less will suffice in terms of the scale and speed of what is required in terms of the reallocation of resources, both financial and intellectual, as well as human resources, in order not just to satisfy the sustainability agenda, keep us under 2 degrees, but also to meet basic, urgent, existential developmental needs, in order to make sure that, exactly when the baby boomers start retiring and the demographic situation in rich countries starts to sort of go downhill, we end up with pension funds, which we've been sort of depending on, being unable to meet any of the promises that were made to us that we'll have a retirement that's funded, right? So all of these things are now off a piece, completely inseparable. And I think that's the context in which to perhaps think of this best as a problem where the two only drivers of all economic growth and prosperity and progress that humanity has taken for granted, which have been broadly defined a use of natural capital, right? And that includes mineral resources, energy, oil, but also renewable forms, right? I mean, historically, we've mostly been using non-renewable sources of natural capital in recent centuries. But before that, everything we did was sort of renewable. It was the sun and the wind. But there's natural capital. And the second is what you can say is human ingenuity, human capital, right? And those are everything else. Financial capital is accumulated surpluses from this, right? What we call IP, intellectual capital, is accumulated surpluses of human ingenuity, past inventions. Everybody is standing on the shoulders of Newton and Einstein. And apart from those two sources, there's nothing else, right? So there's good news perspective and a bad news perspective. The good news perspective is that there has never been a time where there has been so much untapped human capital as exists in the world today. Literally, billions of people, mostly in the emerging developing world, mostly young, itching to get an opportunity to be the best version of themselves. Most of them willing to work twice as hard as you and I would ever want to, right? There has never been so much spare human capital, despite the fact all our headlines in the West are dominated by demographic decline, labor market shortages, and so on and so forth. Globally, the problem is exactly the opposite. And on the natural capital side, right? I mean, what you started with, that had we been at this same point in climate, at the same point in biodiversity loss, but without the benefit of the leaps and frogs technological progress that has characterized the past 10, 20 years, particularly in solar and renewables and battery, for example, right? We'd be in a much, much worse place, right? I mean, we'd still have to confront all those challenges, but without any of the benefits of technology. So for the first time, we have these two massive untapped sources of potential solutions that are sitting right at our doorstep. And add to that, the stock of financial capital has never been as high as it is today, partly.
I know, it's incredible. We're swimming in money.
We are literally, I mean, not you and I personally.
I wish, but as a
But
planet, we've got more capital on the planet than ever before in history. You're right.
except it's in all of the wrong places. And
In
so
the wrong places.
The best way to think about it is the human, the future of sort of, human and natural capital in the world in terms of where the stock is. lies mostly in what we call emerging and developing economies, right? It is the decisions made or not made by the likes of India, Brazil, Indonesia, Sub-Saharan Africa that will determine what happens on human capital and natural capital over the next 20, 30 years, right? We in the West primarily have intellectual capital and financial capital, which are, accumulated surpluses, given, part colonialism, part whatever, I'm not getting into politics, but whatever it is. So we have the benefit of having both the cutting edge sort of latest technological progress in terms of intellectual capital, be it AI, be it, often renewables, etc., and oodles of money coming out from our ears in terms of the, AUM with pension funds, etc. But just not enough is being put in exactly the places where the person who gets the first mobile phone, who gets the first productive job, is able to leapfrog in productivity, not just in terms of what they personally get out of it and human development, but in terms of the contribution they can make to the world, right? And to extend the example you offered of how much of the world's infrastructure between now and 2050 will be put in developing economies, right? I mean, just to, I think if I remember correctly, India alone is expected to use more steel and cement than North America, South America, and the EU combined over the next 30 years, right? So in that sense, does it matter if the next installation of steel in Brussels or Sweden or Oslo is green or not? Well, maybe marginally.
It helps, but
does it matter that every single new machinery, every single new building, every bit of infrastructure built, every technology being deployed across the developing world today is the latest, most cutting edge of the greenest possible, whether it's energy generation, whether it's green cement, whether it's green steel, not absolutely. Without that, the numbers simply don't add up. And to conclude this point, right? I mean, the basic macro thing we're doing is we are trying to replace an exploitative, non-renewable use of natural capital model with one which has a higher upfront capital cost, but is able to use renewable circular models, right? And whatever India may manage miraculously, whatever South Africa may manage miraculously in terms of domestic capital mobilization, right? Outside of China, no other emerging developing economy of size has got enough domestic capital in order to meet more than a fraction of the investment needs to even stay under, I would say, 2.5 degrees, not even 2 degrees, right? And so if the world wants to, which I think it absolutely has to, needs to, stay under 2.5, 2 degrees, there is no choice but to deploy both technology and capital at scale in developing and emerging economies, no matter how difficult the details might be, right? So the details matter, but they are second or third order. And luckily, we are in a place where this logic is completely consistent with a financial return, financial risk minimizing and financial return maximizing logic over the medium long term, right? Because that is where dollar for dollar, every dollar going into a capital scarce country like India, full of human capital potential, versus a dollar being deployed in, capital saturated Netherlands or the United States, has a much, much greater chance, not just in terms of tackling climate, but in terms of delivering growth, in terms of financial return possibilities over the medium to long term, and of course, human welfare. And if we don't do that, these countries are not going to sit still. They are going to do what each of our countries does, which is every leader who wants to ever get reelected has to first promise their citizens and to some extent deliver basic human needs, jobs, housing, infrastructure, education. And if our money, our technology sharing global policy space that allows these countries to have a development model that is consistent with keeping us under 2 degrees are not available, they will just continue to pump coal, use unsustainable levels of domestic groundwater, use fertilizers that is going to run off, cut down forests, right? Development versus climate, anytime this becomes a real binding imperative, particularly at low levels of income, development will always win out, as we are seeing in case after case. And when even us in the West, who have the luxury of, fairly fantastic lifestyles, when our political leaders face even marginally difficult political choices in the short term, look at the rollbacks to climate commitments, not just by countries, right? But even our corporate titans, big banks, financial institutions. We are in the era where over the past 6 months, so many commitments have been rolled back, even for the people for whom this trade-off would be anything but difficult.
But in a way, Sonny, which is one of the points where perhaps we disagree. Commitments, look at Donald Trump. The real issue is self-interest. And I think going to your earlier point, we have capital. We need to deploy it. Where the return's going to be, I've just come back from a week in Japan where they rightfully point out to me they're responsible for 3% of global emissions. Not a massive, useful, about the same as Australia, actually. And they have nevertheless embarked on a major green transformation program for Japan. It's great, right? Wonderful. I want to support them. They can get, instead of the current ambitious target of 35% renewable energy by 2035, they could get to 85%, according to a few interesting reports and so on. All of that's great. I think it's really important because then they develop the capacity to be able to support other countries. So the developed Japanese industry, not for Japan's sake, but for the export potential of Japanese industry, and matching that with the capital export, because Japan has large surfeit of capital. It's got to go to Southeast Asia or South Asia or wherever to earn a return. And the point you made at the beginning is the point that always rings in my ears. Years ago, I remember a speech by a senior politician in a Anglo country who decried the demographic challenge that we face. Oh, it's terrible. People aren't having enough kids. We're shrinking. We have a crisis. And all I could think of is racism. We have a world of young people who are so educated, who are so keen, as you say. And I can remember talking just a couple of weeks ago to a young woman in Kenya who had a diploma, who kept saying, how do I do more? Where can I get, and I want to say, get a systems management degree, but of course that's not available in Nairobi. The enthusiasm, the keenness, the hard work was just palpable in front of me. And I'm thinking, if we want to create a future to give us returns for our pension funds, pay my pension when I retire, we have to invest in these young people all around the world. Otherwise, we have no chance. And that's the story of Japan. Japan's got a choice now. Is it going to allow 2 million young people to move to Japan, which might be forced to with climate, or is it going to invest in Pakistan, Indonesia, to get returns, allow them to make jobs near their families and get education and get a return for Japanese pension funds? This is the topic of the decade, possibly the topic of the millennia. Sonny, you've been talking about this with central banks, with governments for a while. How are we going on the elephant shifting?
Well, very few good words about Corona, with one exception. What the pandemic did was it normalized the remote delivery of high value added services.
Indeed.
Webinars before, I did webinars before, right? But your life and mine and those of most of our colleagues has changed dramatically because, Zoom existed. I'd never heard of it, but Zoom existed. But at peak lockdown, 2/3 of American and 2/3 of EU GDP was delivered entirely remotely, right? Clearly, that's not equilibrium, but in rich economies where 80% and rising of our GDP is in the form of services, many of which are suitable for remote delivery, that showed what I think is the new equilibrium. And perhaps it's good to look back at some work that Charles Goodhart, my colleague at the LSE, did. And he showed that the biggest driver of the last golden age of globalization between the fall of the Berlin Wall and China's entry into the WTO, which over those 20, 30 years delivered outsized financial returns, this Goldilocks inflationary environment, massive poverty reduction, job creation, development gains across the world, right? That was driven by a doubling of the number of workers engaged in globally productive supply chains in goods, right? Just in goods. And goods are only 20 to 30% of global GDP, maybe 40% in some, rare emerging economies. But for the most part, they're small and shrinking. Now, imagine if we went down that road with services. The economic potential based on work I've been doing in my role at the European University Institute in Florence is at least twice as large. So, in an environment sort of full of bad news, maybe this is a good time to say that we are potentially sitting at the cusp of what could be, what should be, and what has to be the next golden age of globalization, this time led by a liberalization of cross-border trade in services, including high value-added services, and the growth potential of this, global growth potential of this, is at least twice as large as what we saw over those magical decades. So is the development potential, the job creation potential, the financial return potential, and very importantly, with some caveats, remote delivery of services is far, far more consistent with a lower carbon footprint, circular economic business model than what has historically been a very high footprint of export of goods. So like for like, yep, in terms of certain value added, with, again, caveats, you could easily have a scenario where export of equivalent value added services from India has a carbon/material footprint that is only a tenth as large as export of goods from China. That is the sort of more disembodied world we need to move towards. But that, again, requires trade liberalization in a world where the WTO's own existence is under sort of question mark now, right? In an environment where everybody is turning inwards rather than outwards. And the path we are on is self-defeating, because one of my very formative experiences was, if you remember in the Euro crisis, and I spent 5 years on that, there was a narrative of Spanish exceptionalism, that Spain uniquely was a country that had 3, 4, 5 million immigrants from Latin America, North Africa, and was the country that was sort of second, third most worst affected by the Euro crisis, high unemployment. And despite that, Spain did not have an anti-immigrant far-right party. And, we speculated, is it because the ghost of Franco still looms large? So all these sort of narratives. And look at Spain now, right? Even look at Portugal. And the basic problem, I think, is as human beings, it's relatively easy for us to be magnanimous and generous and welcoming and positive if our instinct is that tomorrow is going to be better than today, right? If the arrow is pointing upwards, if I believe that my children are going to have a better future than I did, right? But what has happened with the low growth, the sclerotic post-crisis growth, etc., has been the narrative has shifted to, rather than my share of an expanding pie, where as long as your absolute share was bigger, even if your relative share was shrinking, you'd still be better off, right? And most people were happy about it. But now this has become a scramble for my share of a shrinking or a stagnant pie, us versus them. And that narrative leads to behavior which inevitably leads us in a downward spiral. And what we need to do, not just for the sake of climate, but for the sake of global growth, our pension sustainability, and to keep us away from global conflict, is to shift that narrative towards a more promising one. And I think without that, none of those things will be tackled.
It's a really interesting point. While you talk about globalization, of course, the response is Vox, is the various reactions around the world. So, we can't have globalization without hope for the marginalized in the countries of the rich too. It's extraordinary that in Germany, for all its wealth, the actual incomes to the bottom 25% have been stagnant for a long, long time, have not done well, despite sharing. And that applies in lots and lots of countries, certainly in the UK, where the income for the bottom 30% has been disastrous over the last 20 years. And poverty in UK is extraordinary. So if we don't address those, we can't move forward in the globalization, or at least there's going to be a reaction and
I completely agree. And again, if you look at the numbers, they're very clear. It wasn't globalization that screwed up. It was the national response to globalization, right? So there was more than enough gains for most countries to go around to distribute more equitably using national policies. And there was a huge spectrum from, the Nordics on the one hand towards, the United States and the UK at the other end of the extreme, which saw different degrees of redistribution of those absolute gains for globalization within, right? And again, we know what good policies for compensating the losers of globalization looks like. We know what redistributive tax policy looks like.
Exactly.
We need to do it better this time, right? So the correct response is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to learn the right lessons, that this time round we want to do it differently, right? And in some sense, Joe Biden and his policies, not all of them, of course, not the sort of nationalism and, the excessive amount of sort of, domestic made in US focus. But on a number of other fronts, there have been reasonably sensible policies that have recognized that there's been a backlash against globalization and have tried to correct belatedly this massive skewed distribution of wealth and opportunity. But that's what we need, right? And without that, in some sense, what we encounter at a global level is far, far worse. Yes, the Rust Belt of the United States has seen, working classes opportunities, denuded, but we are leaving a far greater number of Indians and sub-Saharan Africans, who will never even get a margin of that opportunity, right? So it's what needs to be done nationally to redistribute those gains. If we don't do that, we are actually leaving the majority of the world's population with no opportunity whatsoever.
We cannot have the globalization. We cannot have the greening without globalization in that sense, but we cannot have the globalization without a strong emphasis on equity and inclusion. And I guess for our listeners, just what Sunny and I are talking about is smooth transition. One thing I learned from my Communist Party friends in China was the phrase smooth transition. Not too much volatility to frighten the horses and risk collapse. Well, when it comes to climate, this is becoming really important because it's going to be a very tough change jumping off the cliff of emissions reductions, which is what we're currently doing. To be able to ensure that we don't have a jagged fight backwards and forth, we don't have the time, unfortunately. We've lost the opportunity of time to get it wrong and go back and forth. We have to ensure we bring everyone with us, or else there will be Trumpian revolutions or the revolutions of populism, which are perhaps ill-informed, we might argue, but it doesn't matter. That's the nature of the economies we live in. We have to make sure that everyone is able to prosper. And of course, everyone can prosper because the nature of what we're doing is a vast capital investment in productive infrastructure and productive cities and productive agriculture that will also clean up areas, remove pollution, make a better life for us. That's if we do it right. Now we have to do it right. And the trouble is we've got to be running while we're doing this thinking. So can we do this? Can we achieve these changes in this rapid time and not stuff it up every second step? I mean, for example, can we shift capital without messing up our equity in richer countries, given that we've messed it up a few times in the past 10 years? Is this possible? And how?
The short answer is the reason you haven't heard from me or seen me in the past sort of 3 odd years is I went deep into trying to answer this question personally. I've got 3 young kids, and as someone who is trained as a
Gorgeous kids
chemical
too.
engineer and and as an environmental scientist, I know what their future looks like right now, right? And it's terrifying. And so the question I set myself, and that's why I started this interdisciplinary work stream at the EUI, was, is it actually possible to reconcile the development aspirations of the Indians and the Brazilians with keeping us under 2 degrees while beginning to arrest biodiversity loss and all of those planetary boundary issues in a manner that is financeable, technologically feasible, thermodynamically, realistic, and politically deliverable. And I did sort of a work program with the Indian G20 that looked at what path would the global economy need to take over the next decade or so in order to try and reconcile these potentially conflicting goals and these very tight boundary conditions that cannot be violated. And that's where this idea of sort of a global growth compact came about. And very briefly, the idea is, as I said, there is, a sort of free lunch possible, next golden age of globalization, which will allow development aspirations and Indians to grow as the Chinese did for many years without destroying the environment completely, which is financeable given the stock of AUMs under global pension funds today, which is technologically feasible at a stretch, which is politically deliverable in the sense there is something there for each of the major groups of countries, with one exception, and I apologize in advance for that, but at least for some of the lowest lying countries, the atolls out in the world, etc., it is potentially too late. There is, over the next few decades, they will have to be relocated, and there are very, very difficult choices. But in terms of the percentage of human population in the world, I mean, they are relatively small. But for all of the major groups of countries, be it Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, the Indias, the Chinas, the EU, and the United States, there is something to be gained. And there are sort of 6 rough elements to it. The first is we need to make sure that we make a promise that's actually deliverable, right? So one big problem, as someone who first introduced climate stress testing in 2008 and 9, sort of have done it for many of the large institutional investors, there's a real problem, right? Let's say you and I, we are the CEO of a large institutional investor, and our government or members ask us to commit to 1.5 degrees, which is still the official goal we're pursuing, right? But everything and everything I know that this is no longer deliverable, right? And in order to align my portfolio with a 1.5 degree, which we are going to overshoot now, I would probably have to churn half of my portfolio, right? And before I'm able to do that, I'm going to get fired. So in my opinion, it is better to have a credible target, let's say 1.7 degrees, 1.8, whatever it is, and then to have that as a coordinating goal towards which we move, which is actually credible, right? But also, time was when it was enough to just make a carbon target, right? And that time is gone. We need to simultaneously also adjust for biodiversity and water, and they're not always pulling in the same direction, right? So that's number one. We need a credible set of targets that we think, there is at least a reasonable chance the world will move towards over the next 5 to 10 years. Number two is we need, for the likes of India, a satisfactory answer to the following question. What is a development model available to a large emerging economy in the 21st century, right? Because if India reach half the resource intensity that China has today, the world has lost 2 degrees. If India reaches the resource intensity that China has today, the world has lost 2.5 degrees. And if Sub-Saharan Africa follows suit, we're way over 3 degrees, right? So the tried and tested development model of the last century, export-led manufacturing growth model, is no longer available to any large emerging economy now because of the carbon constraint, the environmental binding constraint, right? So that is where the potential of the services-led liberalization comes into play, which luckily, thanks to Corona, has been turbocharged. It has, normalized these sorts of conversations, and that is the way to go. So that's the on the trade side. Number three, on clean
but just I just want to just say to our audience two things. First, on the 1.5, 1.7, I'll disagree with you on one point, only because if we have 1.7, it's a huge, much more carbon. With the aim for 1.5, knowing we're going to get to 1.8 and maybe bring it back down. So, but your point generally is about the three targets is absolutely correct. The second point for our listeners is intellectual frameworks. These kinds of frameworks of thinking are actually incredibly important right now, because when you look at things in an entirely different way, you get these aha moments, like the issue about the global demographic pyramid, which is actually perfectly shaped to be able to support the kind of growth we need to pay pensions for those of us who are getting older in the rest of the world. If you start thinking in that globally, it changes everything. If you think about it in terms of just Italy, it's a disaster. Thinking of the intellectual frameworks, such as around what development constitutes, are not small things, are not abstract things, they're not academic things. They are central to get the framing right to do the practical planning for the future. I just put that in everyone's minds. Keep going, next point, Sonny.
Clean minerals, a central important part of the transition. The appropriate response is not the Norwegian or the American or the European one. Everybody's going to, build domestic self-sufficient supply chains of lithium and cobalt and copper. Luckily, the best resources, the most easily commercially viable resources lie often in Africa, in Latin America, in parts of Asia, right? And we screwed up on mining last time. There's no two ways about it, right? The resource curse was very real. There is no mining that is not filthy, polluting, corrupt, often causing Dutch disease, including in a country like Norway, right? But we know how to do it better.
We do. We learned, hopefully.
The difference between, toxic artisanal mining versus the cleanest technology mining, the difference between using escrow accounts, anti-corruption tools versus, Democratic Republic of Congo, the difference between, putting in place wealth funds, fiscal management rules, etc., versus complete Dutch disease wipeout, etc., is huge. We need a plan. There needs to be a 5 to 10 year gestation period for large mining projects. Right now, we're massively behind schedule. The appropriate way to do it is large scale deployment in exactly these countries, which, unlike India and Indonesia, are actually, are further behind on the development curve, right? For them, the resource curse can be turned around using a strategy of having 10, 15 diverse supply chains rather than, trying to build everything at home. And it's a fantastic opportunity to benefit from the transition, right? So the mining compact is sort of the third essential element. The fourth is the financial compact, right? So we are at the end of what has been a period of super normal profitability in the Western financial sector over the last 3 decades, right? And of course, we know what drove it. There was a halving of corporate tax rates from about 40 to 20% since the late 80s, right? There was a secular decline in interest rates until very recently, followed by $10 trillion of quantitative easing, which bought existing assets, didn't finance, new assets, etc., right? And you take all of them together with the very benign inflationary environment because of the China shock, the positive golden age of globalization, which shifted the burden away from, the relative power imbalance between labor and capital. We managed in the Western financial system to generate 68% annualized rates of return with a OECD/home bias of 85, 90%, investing mostly in rich economies, which only grew at 2 or 3%, right? At one point, the rules of arithmetic catch up. And we are at near record levels of corporate profits as a share of GDP. We are, there is nowhere room to go. The forward-looking projection of returns over the next decade or 2 decades from current investment strategies of mostly investing in other OECD economies is abysmal, right? I mean, in order to be viable, our pension funds need annual returns of somewhere between 6 to 8% year on year.
Not going to come from German bonds.
No, and they're not going to come from, investing in S&P 500 either, right? Not forever. So there is, mathematically speaking, no way forward apart from large-scale reallocation towards countries which actually have a GDP growth potential of 6 to 8%, which most of these emerging economies with young demographics, a shortage of capital, actually do. And that's the way to go.
Hey, let me just stop there for the moment. Folks listening to us, and we've got a whole lot of people on LinkedIn listening as well. Next time, everyone, join the Zoom so we can get Q&A with you if you put your hand up. But this is a really critical point. There is a financial logic which is helping us here, because as Sony says, there is no path forward investing in our own markets. The only logic to get us the returns is to invest in emerging markets. So we're not talking about forcing open a door here to flows between North and South. We're talking about helping a door that is already trying to open. We have the force with us. This gives me hope. This gives me hope, Sonny.
And that's the return perspective. There's a risk perspective that also luckily points in exactly the same direction, right? So if I asked you, hey, Sean, does this shiny little investment look good to you? You say, well, let me look at the rest of my portfolio, right? We do portfolio-based investments. It's impossible to answer the question in isolation if you don't know what the rest of your portfolio looks like. And right now, 80 to 90% of our portfolios, including that of the Norwegian Oil Fund, for example, is exposed to OECD economies facing shared problems of demographic decline, political polarization, being close to the technological frontier, and potential growth rates in a good year in a place like Italy of, 1.5%, right? And from these portfolios, right, even if there was an emerging market opportunity that did not offer me 8%, but only offered me 2 or 3%, it would still make sense to want to diversify some of the risk into economies that are structurally different, that have a demographic profile that is different, right? That have technological drivers. They are far from the technological frontier. They're different, where the population supports rather than, is marching against globalization, right? So both the risk and the return perspective from where we are in the Western financial system today point in exactly the same direction, which also happens to be the direction that's going to drive global growth and sustainability and help us tackle climate change. We are very lucky.
Absolutely, very lucky. At that point, I've got to realize we're nearly up to the hour, so I've got to just quickly turn to the audience. We get a couple of questions, but if anyone on the Zoom call wants to put up their hand, that'd be fantastic. Look, folks, some of the questions I'm not going to deal with. Alexandra Oliveira, we engage in Brazil, we engage in LATAM lots of ways. Pick it up separately by email. Happy to connect you with the Brazilian team. How do we encourage issuance of green bonds? Folks, issuing a green bond is signaling that you're doing something. If you're an emerging market, issuing a green bond is signaling to northern investors, local investors, we're doing something. And they're worried that there is a tsunami of change coming through the global economy for all the reasons we have. We're trying to make it not too choppy because we'll get blowbacks and go slower. But in the meantime, investors are saying, help, find me things that are going in the right direction. Find me things that are less likely to be at risk of being swamped going forward. That's what a green bond is. That's the argument going forward. One of my favorite analysts is on the call, actually, Christina Nung in Australia. Christine, any comments or reflections that I can get you to put you on the spot to ask? You should be able to talk.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Far away.
All right. So that was a really, let's just say, a really interesting debate that we've just heard, and a really relevant one for me at the moment because I'm working on a piece that is focused on Indonesia. So while we have Sunny on the call as well, and hello, Sunny, I don't think I've met you. I guess I have a question about how do you actually deal with the situation where there are some markets, mostly emerging markets, that are justifying, say, we need new coal or gas plants to enable the country's role in the energy transition. For example, in Indonesia, and I'm sure most of you are aware of this, or at least the speakers on the call, Indonesia is saying that we need new coal plants to power new smelters that are off-grid. And this is our contribution to the global battery production. How do you reconcile that when thinking about, I guess, the growth of green finance, not wanting to be doing the wrong things as well, and all of the, I guess, the conundrum that you've just highlighted earlier.
May I? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, let's just for a second, pretend we are the leaders of Indonesia and India. And if I was speaking in that capacity, I would, honestly speaking, probably make the same argument because it is a legitimate one. Let me give you an example, right? I mean, I have been guilty once and never again of having publicly, finger pointed and said, in 90% of the world, solar is the cheapest form of power, right? Except it's just not true. It's true, subject to the caveats that there is no scarcity of liquidity, there's no binding capital constraint, there is no binding liquidity constraint, there is no binding foreign exchange constraint, there is a grid capacity available and storage, right? And it's levelized cost, which is a very specific interpretation of cost. And if I asked you, hey, I've never been to an emerging market, I spent my whole life in Norway, what does it look like? For most emerging economies, particularly, let's say, in sub-Saharan Africa, you'll say, well, terrible infrastructure, perpetual scarcity of foreign exchange, capital, liquidity, repeated problems, right? So those just don't hold true. And particularly for countries where the choice is between having to import large capital, upfront capital costs, transformers, electric grid equipment, solar panels, etc., most of which are not manufactured domestically, where for a much smaller amount of capital, you can have a gas turbine or a coal plant, and you have domestic reserves of gas and coal available, right? So it goes back. The link with financing is absolutely intimate and crucial, which is we have the rhetoric on green financing has far, far, far exceeded the actual delivery of green financing. And without that significant upfront capital being made available together with appropriate technology and capital of maybe up to 2 to 3 times more for a quality adjusted source of power, those countries which face capital constraint, where for in India, there's a choice between primary school or solar versus coal, right? Will continue to make the choices that are both wrong for them domestically because coal kills more people than any other fossil fuel every year, mostly domestically in those countries, and bad for us globally, right? So there's a shared interest, and the problem is without delivery of appropriate finance. And India has, for an example, has laughed at the kinds of suggestions that were made by the likes of Germany on the Just Transition Plan, JETP, because the amounts of, the sums of money being spoken about were so tiny compared to what India needed to do to deliver power to its citizens and for, its industrialization plans, that India said it was just not worthwhile engaging.
And there's a wonderful piece by Adam Tooze, Christina, who's about JETP just recently. I'm just going to add that, essentially the secret is cheap capital for green. I'm meeting a little later this afternoon with the Japan Bank for International Cooperation folks, where there is a shift going. They have abandoned coal. They've effectively abandoned LNG gas, thank goodness. And they are shifting to grow green investments, which is essentially cheap capital for green investments. We need to do a lot more of that. In Indonesia, as we know, actually solar is, on a straight technology basis, pretty cheap, but there are significant structural barriers to solar, notably PLN's vast cost of charges, folks, if they build solar farms. connected to the grid. Why? Because PLN is bankrupt and having to extract a living out of its existing coal-fired power stations. Unless we solve the financial conundrum of PLN for the government, we are unlikely to be able to move forward. And it's going to take more money than was offered for, as Sony said, for the JET-B program. Indonesia is one of the hardest cases, I'm going to say, particularly because the extent to which coal is embedded in the political economy infrastructure of the country. Other countries, well, in India, where just recently I did an event in Mumbai, I can tell you that every single coal-fired power station company I'm talking to in India, including National Thermal Power Company, says no capex going to coal. They're still operating, they're sweating, but the days of capex going to coal are gone. And that includes Adani, by the way, he tells me this. All the capex now is going to renewables green. The National Thermal Power Company of India, the government-owned operator of the majority of coal-fired power stations, says that by 2030, it'll be 50% a clean energy company. So the change is happening. How do we accelerate the purpose of today's call? If NTPC can get cheaper money than the Indian government can currently borrow out, which is not that cheap, it would make everything, because it would make a huge difference, because fundamentally, the big challenge of renewables is capex cost. I can still remember the CEO of Solar Direct telling me about 7 years ago why Solar Direct, a French solar company, was winning auctions in India. They at that year winning the majority of auctions for solar. He says entirely in the financial engineering. Capital cost when it comes to renewables is everything. We can sort that out because we have the capital in the rich countries, and we can afford to offer it at a very preferential rate and still get a return for our pension funds. How we make that work in Indonesia, I realise you're in the middle of that, Christina, and everyone else in the call in their own countries, is of course the challenge in practice, but the task that we have to tackle. We need to wrap up, Sonny. It's already the end of the hour. Can you believe it? Final words.
Me?
Yes, you, my friend, you in Oslo,
Well,
sitting in front of your
so
great
you know,
patients.
there's reason for despair. We are hurtling towards the cliff faster than, you know, at an accelerating pace. And the scientist in me, you know, struggles with depression and being able to look my kids in the eye honestly. But at the same time, right? I mean, it could have been so much worse if we were in a situation where the demographics were different, where we were struggling with, you know, savings in the global economy, where technology and solar and battery had not matured at this level, right? So because when you look at the climate debate, I mean, you know, half of the stories are, you know, deep existential angst, and half the stories seem to be, you know, sunny optimism. And the fact is, they're both true, but which one of these becomes the global truth over the next 10 years or so is up to us. So let me end with the following thought, right? So everybody listening here is involved, like Sean and I are, in this space. And I would stick my neck out and say that maybe there's only about, you know, 100, maybe 500 of us, if I'm generous, in the whole world who are a very rare combination of being well-informed, well-connected, and well-meaning, right? Can we all make sure that whatever we are doing in our day job in this space is not just, you know, micro-significant, but so ambitious that if successful, however low likelihood, you know, the chances of success might be, but if successful, will have a chance of turning the tanker around. And if you yourself, given the job profile, cannot do it, make sure that part of your headspace, because you, my friends, and I, we are the scarce resource. There's enough capital, technology has matured, the macroeconomic situation is right. There's just not enough of us. We need to make sure we're working towards turning the tanker, because otherwise we would have succeeded and, you know, won a few skirmishes and battles, but we are completely on track to lose the war. We need to win the war.
Beautiful. That applies to all of you, including you, Chris Colville, who's done a podcast with me that's also available on LinkedIn right now. Thanks for joining us today. We've got an incredible trifecta Sonny's made clear to us. We've got the demography, we've got the technology, and we have the capital. I mean, it seems crazy to say this, Sonny, but you did say this. How lucky are we? How lucky are we? We have the mix, but now we have to make it work. We're talking about transition opportunity plans next time we have a town hall. And these are plans to make advantage of this trifecta. Join us next month. Keep an eye out for the date and time, and keep an eye out for the work Sonny and I are going to be doing to stimulate you further with some of our political framing. And above all, be successful. We all need to be successful now. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Sonny.